I'm joined today by Katya Adler. Katya is one of Britain's most well-known journalists who, through her role as the BBC's Europe editor, has become a household name. Serving in the role since 2014, she has reported tirelessly through every stage of the Brexit journey. She is one of 4 presenters of the popular podcast and television series Brexitcast. A foreign correspondent throughout her career, she has previously served as the BBC's Berlin, Madrid, and Middle East correspondents. Katya has received numerous awards for her work, including the Carls Wheeler Award for Outstanding Contribution to Broadcast Journalism. Katya, thank you so much for joining us here today. It is a pleasure to be hosting you.
It's lovely to see you.
I wanted to start off right at the beginning of your career, which you started in journalism at the Austrian Broadcasting Corporation, working on children's TV, before then changing jobs to cover the Kosovo War. Could you tell us about the early days working on children's TV and how they might have prepared you for becoming a foreign correspondent?
Yes, I don't know where you would want me to start with children's TV, but I think what I wanted to do was get into news. But I think it's always, we always have to bear in mind that you can't just start where you want to end up, right? So it's all very well to say I would like to be a foreign correspondent, or I wanted to work in war zones and in conflict areas, but you can't just walk there out of university and say ta-da. So while I was at university, I studied languages, and in my third year, I basically had the choice of doing what I wanted, either to study or to work, as long as I wrote 2 dissertations, because I was studying 2 languages. So I thought I should get some journalism experience. So I ended up in Vienna for 6 months, and where I was working at the Austrian Broadcasting Corporation, basically, general dog's body, helping things and, doing everything. And then I went to Reuters in Rome. And I loved my time at Reuters. Berlusconi, sort of arguably Europe's first modern populist leader, had just been elected, and there's furore everywhere. So even as the kind of, the young one in the corner, you've got to do amazing stories across the whole summer because everyone else has gone off on holiday. So I got absolutely hooked on news, but I decided that news agency work wasn't actually what I wanted. And after university, I went back to Austria, but I didn't go back to the radio station because it was an English language radio station, and I wanted to immerse myself in Austrianness and really being able to speak the language. So I said, right, for a year, no English speaking friends, and work for an Austrian company only. And at the end of that year, I was thinking, what should I do next? Or I might go into a management training program in Coca-Cola. It come up. So I applied for it, and I got a job from my old boss at the radio station, who said, I hear you've been in Vienna for a year. What the hell are you doing? Why haven't you called me? And I said, well, I'm now going to go into management training. And she said, bullshit. She said, come over here. Am I allowed to say that to you? And they said, come over here, and I'm going to give you 2 programs, and let's see what you can do. And I was like, amazing. So she gave me 2 programs. So there was one was a quiz show for the under 10s, a bilingual quiz show, and one was a teenager show where you talked about, sex and homework and stuff. And it wasn't news, but they were my own show. So I just stayed night after night on my own in the radio station, because you had to, like, nowadays it's great. I have a cameraman, I have a producer. I was on my own, so I had to learn how to, what they call it, drive the desk. So all of those faders, and had to take in calls and play music and have microphones going, and so it was a really intense experience, and it was amazing. I mean, it was amazing. Unfortunately for me, in a way, unfortunately, the young kids show was a roaring success, because we invented a cat that was with me in the studio, except it wasn't. So if the children didn't know the answers to something, the cat would whisper in my ear, and I'd give a clue to the child, who would then win the prize. And so the Austrian Ministry of Education wanted to sponsor this program. And I got sent on a tour around Austria for about 6 months, I think, where I would travel during the week to Austrian schools, and at the weekend come back to Vienna to do the program. And all I can tell you about the show is that these days, still, all these years on, if I hear the hokey cokey, I start twitching uncontrollably, and basically, so they had to find a smallish man who'd fit into a cat costume, who then accompanied me on these trips, and it was crazy and hilarious. But the whole time I was pushing and pushing to move to the news department, and my boss at the time didn't want me to move because that was very popular. So I applied for a job with a new TV station in Vienna, and I got the job as a presenter on TV and presented that to her. And so she put me in news, and that's often how things go, right? And so that took me to my first war in '99 in Kosovo, and that was radio, not TV. And so I was on my, sent off there with the Austrian army down to Kosovo with a flak jacket and fear and excitement at the new adventure.
So what were these early days like reporting from Kosovo? And at what stage did you find the conflict in '99? Could you give us a bit more background on that?
At what stage did I what? Sorry.
At what stage did you find the conflict in 1999? What was it like then?
At what stage of the war was the conflict?
Yes.
So basically, as I'd come back to Austria after my degree, you had the Balkan Wars raging in ex-Yugoslavia, and it was really powerful there because we had a lot of refugees coming to Vienna, and so I met a lot of people. We also set up at the beginning of the Kosovo War. The Austrian Broadcasting Corporation set up a voluntary radio, so we all volunteered for it. It was called Radio Neighbour in Need, and it was supposed to dovetail with BBC World Service. And so we offered information, but also like the Red Cross trying to match people who'd lost relatives, kids looking for parents, parents looking for kids. And we broadcast through the night in English, in German, Serbo-Croat is a language, but just to tell you how fraught the relations were at the time, we had a Serbian and a Croatian speaker because it was so sort of divided, and then Albanian, for Kosovo, and it was a really powerful experience for me, working with people who had been involved in the conflict, and just sort of you work through the night and then you do your day job. That was just an introduction to the rest of my life in breaking news at the BBC. And I kept pushing to go. I wanted to go into Kosovo. Austria took a neutral role in the war. Austrians are a neutral country. So basically, the military said that I could go with them into Kosovo when they were taking a military convoy. I remember my boyfriend at the time didn't want me to go, and I was absolutely determined to go. And I remember the morning, I had to get up at 3 a.m. and go to the station, the main station in Vienna, and take a train down to the south where I was meeting the military. I felt so lonely that day, like really scared, really lonely. I had to sign a piece of paper before I left for the Austrian Broadcasting Corporation saying basically if I died, it wasn't their fault. It was like really scary stuff for me. And I think one of my first introductions to a war zone was we were driving in convoy with the military and some Red Cross trucks, and we stopped in Croatia, which not that long ago had a conflict. I mean, it was the least bloody of the bloody conflict. But anyway, so I was desperate to pee, and I kept saying, I need to pee, I need to pee, I need to pee. Another introduction to war reporting, you never get to pee. And anyway, so we were going through Croatia, the truck stopped, like it was like a pee stop, if you like. And I got out the truck, and we were by an open field, and I went towards the field, and they were like, stop, mines. And it was all mines. And I was about to run into that field to pee. So they saved my lives, but I had this sort of rather humiliating experience. Again, introduction to a war zone. You can't have any situation too humiliating when it comes to when you need to pee. Where I had to pee between 2 trucks because it was either do that or not pee for another I don't know how many hours, or risk getting blown up in a field. So that was my first introduction. That was before we got to Kosovo. Then we had to go to the Serbian Republic, where everyone was armed. There were armed men everywhere. I'd never seen that before. I'd never experienced that before. And then into Kosovo. In Kosovo, it was the women and children that
Mm-hmm.
hit me, and that, to be honest, it was partly growing up watching the news with my parents.
Mm-hmm.
And there was the BBC reporter Katya Adler at the time, and she would go a lot to conflict areas in Africa. She reported on famine. She'd say how the famine was man-made; it didn't need to happen, and it was because of conflict. And I thought she was so brave, and I thought she was telling the truth, a capital T and a capital T. This was
Mm-hmm.
before the post-truth world of Trumpism, and I wanted to do that. I wanted to do that. I wanted to stand up for the children and the women, and I wanted to tell people, get off your sofa and realize what's going on. That was what I felt in me. And when I went to Kosovo, you know, like many armies, unfortunately, the Serbian army was using rape as a weapon of war, and in close-knit sort of Muslim communities were raping women in order to divide the community. And break people's spirit. This was part of the war effort, if you like. And it just devastated me. You know, I was more than the fear. I remember in my mind when I look back. I mean, it's quite a long time ago. But when I look back, I remember the fear going in, but I remember the sorrow in there. And then the ignorance afterwards, because after the war, I went to Macedonia where there were camps, refugee camps, for example, to report from those. And again, because I was in Austria, I went with the Austrian army, and there was a UN troop called KFOR, Kosovo Force. So, you know, I was with them, and, you know, you were with the refugees. And the army was handing out spam to these refugees. Well, spam is made from, you know, pigs, and of course, if you're Muslim and an observant, you couldn't eat that. But the Red Cross and they didn't think about that, you know. So it was again, I think these were all sort of the beginning of learning experiences that then echoed for me so much when I was then working across the Middle East. You know, cultural ignorance that, you know, it was well meant. You know, they didn't mean anything bad, but actually, if you think about it, it was quite crass at the same time. And there were these women surrounded by male soldiers, and, you know, and everything they'd been through. But it was the gang rape and the mass rape, and rape as a tool of war, that I really took back with me from that experience. And because I did so much work on it to try and highlight that, I started getting hate mail from some people, which in those days wasn't on the internet, because the World Wide Web was just beginning. Can you believe it? But it was letters. So all the time I kept going back to Kosovo during the war, and then after the war, I was getting these letters to the office saying, you know, if you care about these women so much, then you should be raped like them so that you really understand. And I went to the police, and at the time there were no stalking laws or, you know, anything like that to protect you. So I think, you know, the law has improved since then to protect women, although never enough, right? But the police basically told me that until this person attacked me, there was nothing that they could do. So although that was nothing in comparison to what these women in Kosovo had been through, there were all these parallels kind of going on for me that sort of resonated. And then, you know, you see the shadows in that sort of your career. The other thing I took for myself through Kosovo, but it was something that I'd learned growing up anyway, is who's the goodie, who's the baddie. Very clearly, these women and children were victims. Did the Kosovo, you know, did the KLA, the Kosovo sort of army, perpetrate crimes? Yes. Were many of them real criminals, and, you know, went on to do gun running after the war? Yes. There is no black and white, and I think that was a big learning experience, which is, again, when it comes to the truth, when you want to broadcast, you have to work for a broadcaster that lets you do the shades of grey, which the BBC has always let me do the shades of grey. And I know that it's come in for lots of flack now, and whatever, nowhere's perfect. But I have always wanted to be. I've been with the BBC now for more than 20 years, and with the Austrian Broadcasting Corporation at the time. They let me make my report, Nobody meddled, and nobody told me to stop making trouble, or you know, to highlight uncomfortable issues. And that was really important for me as well. So if you like, there were all these tools along the way that then fed into my later career, or set up sort of flashpoints or signals for me of things that would be important for me in my reporting.
So when you were reporting from Kosovo, Middle East, all these war zones where women were being treated so badly, how were you as a reporter treated kind of differently? And how was the fact that you too were a woman viewed on the front lines?
So it's interesting because I think, well, first of all, when I was in the Middle East, and I loved working in the Middle East. I mean, I was, again, it was my, you know, I've always set these big goals. So my big goal was to do war reporting, and then it was war reporting for the BBC, and then it was Middle East, right? So, you know, and at every stage, just to let you know, at every stage there were people saying, you can't do that because you're too young, you're too inexperienced, you're a woman, you didn't go to the right university, you didn't go to the right school, or whatever it was. It's like, my big advice always is, do not listen to the naysayers, but you need to listen to yourself. So sometimes you pursue a path and it's not the right one. You need to know that, but don't listen to the people who are saying no. That's in the Middle East. I started because I wanted to prove myself there. There was no way at that point in my career that I could have applied for a Middle East job and got it at the BBC. I had gone to Madrid and as the BBC's correspondent, and a year into my job there were the Madrid train bombings. That was in 2004. And so that sort of really boosted my profile. And I've always found that quite ironic, because it's like, in your introduction, you said, you know, in this job, I reported every twist and turn of Brexit, and most of you're very kindly to mention the awards in this job, most of them have been linked to the Brexit coverage. Of course, because it was, until the coronavirus, the story of a generation, and you know, and it's massively high profile. But since I started even this job that I'm in 2014, we've had all the cross-border terror attacks, you know, Paris, Brussels, remember that? The migration crisis, remember that? The rise of the populist right across Europe, Le Pen, you know, 2016, remember that? I was across all of those stories, often at the same time as the Brexit. But no one remembers that because of Brexit. And I think it's sort of similar in the Middle East or wherever you are. People will remember, or you will get noticed for one story. So for me in Madrid, it was the Madrid train bombings, because that shot you much more onto kind of people's consciousness. But I had been slogging for years and years already, you know, I mean, at the Austrian Broadcast Corporation, then at the BBC from 2000. So I'd been there already for 4 years before the train bombings, running around, crossing Europe, covering breaking stories, doing all sorts of things. But it's that thing that catches people's attention. So, you know, again, it's a lesson not to not work hard, because I think you shouldn't get anywhere if you don't work hard. But you won't necessarily get what you deserve. That's just not always how it happens. So first of all, you need to do things to get yourself noticed. I don't mean take your clothes off or rob a bank, or, you know, I don't mean that. What I mean is you need to keep looking for those opportunities, and until they come along, you just I don't know what to say. I'm not a massively political person, even though I'm interested in politics, but you have to. When I moved to the BBC from Vienna, I was most interested in World Service Radio on Europe. But actually, considering that my goal was to become the foreign correspondent for the BBC, I couldn't have got more into the back office than that. So I wasn't thinking strategically. I didn't regret it, though, because I had an amazing time and it was really interesting. But had I really been, you know, fiercely ambitious, I would have thought it through in another way. I don't regret that. So for me, the bombings inadvertently just sort of pushed me forward. And I think that's something about conflict reporting as well. Although Madrid wasn't a conflict zone before then, but then in the Middle East, you realize that and it's not just me who says this, by the way, it's other colleagues, so this is not some great wisdom of mine. but the worst day of somebody else's life is often a very good day in your work. Good, very much in inverted commas, okay? But what I mean is that you will get a lot of work out. You may find it professionally very satisfying that day because you get that message out. You'll get into the front part of the news, like the 10 o'clock or the 6, rather than the back. And you will get your story across. And if it's for your ego, you will be more prominent, you know, depending on your priorities, or a mix of all of them. But you are very aware that the people that you are reporting on are having the worst time. A, B, for us, normally, we can leave those conflict zones. But the people you're reporting on cannot. That's their reality. And I think you have to carry that humility with you all the time, and that awareness, you know, all the time. And I totally digressed. So you asked about what it was like as a woman.
Yes, I did.
So as a woman and a young woman, I think there were various things you come across, which is sexism in your own career, like in your own organization, or in war reporting in general, which again, I think has improved since then, but hasn't gone away. And when working in sort of predominantly Muslim cultures, and often with extremist organizations like Islamic Jihad in Gaza or something like that, you have the problem of their fighters not wanting to look at you, or not being allowed to look at you or address you directly. So you'll sometimes find yourself in an interview situation where, so there would be a man, I'd sit in a chair and there'd be a man standing behind me. And so in this particular case, the Islamic Jihad fighter would speak to that man and not to me, to kind of get around it. Or I remember in Gaza, when Hamas had just taken over Gaza, and I was very pregnant. I was very insistent in my first pregnancy to keep on going. And I went in up until the point where the BBC basically called me and just said, you are not going into Gaza anymore, so that's it. But so the BBC had this armoured vehicle, a white armoured vehicle, which was quite rattly. We called her Miss Piggy. And the door, so she had these kind of metal doors at the back, very narrow metal doors you had to open, and 3 steps you had to get up. And I was so front heavy that, plus sort of I would find it hard to get up the steps. So my cameraman, an Australian, was just like, he said it was such a dilemma, because normally he'd give me a great shove from behind to get me through the doors, except that you've got Hamas in a convoy behind you, and of course they'd have been absolutely appalled at that. And that made me laugh. He said he used to have nightmares, the cameraman, about, he doesn't have kids, he used to have nightmares about having to deliver the baby in Gaza, and he sort of would read up about like hot towels, or you know what he would do. But yeah, obviously as a woman it's challenging, but on the other hand, you get more access to women in the Middle East, and from very conservative cultures who wouldn't necessarily be allowed to talk to you otherwise, or who wouldn't feel good talking to you. But the idea of just doing a vox pop in the street, you know, when you just ask general people's opinions, you find in the Middle East that women often won't talk because they feel they shouldn't talk, even if they want to talk in the street. So you kind of have to organize things, but not everywhere. I mean, it depends where in the Middle East you are. But I never found really that it was a big disadvantage at all. Much to my husband's disgust at the time, when I was 8 months pregnant, I traveled by road on my own from Jerusalem to Damascus, which meant I didn't walk, clearly, or take public transport. But what you would do is you would just get cars to pick you up at the various different stages. And he was like, what happens if you go into labor in the middle of nowhere? And I was like, oh, it's fine. I think it was only after having my baby that I realized that was a really reckless, stupid thing to do, actually. And I would do things very differently. But I think I felt very aware at the time that was my identity, and I was frightened of losing it, because I'd fought so hard for that position. And as much as, I was happy about the pregnancy, but I didn't want it to take that away. And so, yeah, I'd say I would do things differently now, because I didn't realize what a precious load I was carrying, and that things don't always work as you plan, right? So I was lucky and stupid, but it was a madcap adventure, and what I mean is nobody stopped me or refused me or didn't give me interviews because I looked like a house, or some viewers didn't like me being heavily pregnant on TV, and offensive, but that just made me want to do 360 degrees pieces to camera, but, so I didn't feel like it was a big disadvantage. One thing that changed massively, it has nothing to do with being a woman. ISIS wasn't around when I was working in the Middle East. The kidnap threat did start while I was there. The fact that saying that you were British or worked for the BBC started being not always a good thing while you were there. And I think while I was there, and I think what was interesting for me, so I started, because I was too inexperienced in BBC terms to go for a job in the Middle East. After Madrid train bombings, I just pushed and pushed and pushed to do bureau cover when someone else was away. So the first time I went to the Middle East was summer 2004, and I filled in for a whole summer and got addicted, got on really well with the bureau chief, who could see a work hound horse, whatever, when he met one, and was quite happy to exploit that. And I was quite happy to be exploited because I really wanted to do it. So that was the beginning of a relationship where over a number of years I would go there for 2 months at a time, and then come back to Madrid. I finally lost my thread. Yes. So when I first started working in the Middle East, we used to have, like, when you were driving around in an armored vehicle or not, depending on where you were, we had a sign that said press in English and in Arabic on the other side. And when we went into villages or conflict areas, we would put the sign on the windshield, so people would know we were press, and our flak jacket said press on it. And then during my years there, I left in 2010, we learned to hide those, because actually it made you a target. So it changed while I was there. A really good friend of mine got kidnapped in Gaza and was taken for a long time, and that was a very dark time for me, for him, for our bureau, and a very anxious time. And thankfully, he was released and he's fine. Although I drove him mad from then on, because whenever I saw him, I'd start crying, and he was just like, Adler, don't cry. Whereas you don't cry in war zones, you don't cry. I didn't cry. You learn to put that visor between you and what you're seeing.
To bring us very, very quickly to the EU, you were appointed, as I said, in 2014 in what became this defining role in your career. Could you talk to us a bit about how things were in 2014, and what the conversation around the EU was, not just in the UK, but kind of around Europe?
Conversation, like in general?
In general, yeah.
I think the biggest irony was that when I took this job, I was worried it was going to be boring. And I think that one of my so what I love about journalism, what I've always enjoyed in a slightly madcap career, is that horrible expression, real people. I hate that. But what I mean is not the politicians, not the business leaders, but those women and children I talked to you about in Kosovo, and who I met again in Gaza, and who I would meet in Jordan, and who I've met in Syria, or I'd meet on the border in Israel that borders Gaza, or whoever it is. And again, remember, not the black and white and the shades of grey. And they felt like, war reporting to me felt like real issues, because it is, because it's life or death, because people are passionate about it. So coming back to Europe, even though I'd started my career doing European politics, I just thought, do I care about German pensions and French wages. I mean, yes, I want everybody to be happy, healthy, and well, but really, is that going to be what I have to talk about now? And as I mentioned earlier, unless you cut that bit out, I kind of started this job, and suddenly there was the Greek debt crisis, and people on the streets, and people with not enough money to feed their families. People demonstrating in the streets, throwing Molotov cocktails. I was right back where I've been for so many years, in conflict and real people with big problems against systems and injustice and all of the rest of it. The migrant crisis, I mean, the Middle East came to Europe. And populism, that's about real people. Because again, I know people hate the word populism. What does it mean? But for me, it means it's the voice of the people. So that you, that is, regardless of whether the politicians are right or wrong, but they don't come from nowhere. They come from a gap in the market. They come from the financial crisis, when people felt absolutely abandoned, when the EU and government, centre left and centre right, colluded, if you like, to bail out the banks, while the middle class disappeared, and while those who already had no money were absolutely destitute. And I lived in Spain through most of the financial crisis, and I saw what it was doing to people. And the rescuing thing for the Spaniards is that the family units are so close. The only grant or sort of benefit that wasn't cut was pensions. Everyone moved in with grandma and grandpa. Grandma and grandpa were buying school shoes. It was, again, it's about real families, real lives, and the politics of populism also. What moves people? People would say in Germany, I haven't voted for 15 years. Now I feel I have a party that represents me. It doesn't matter as a journalist in the BBC, which is why I work there, what your personal opinion is. Who gives a hoot what your personal opinion is? Same for Brexit. You have to get under the skin of the story and the people who hold beliefs, and get behind the politicians' words. What are they missing out? Not just what they're saying. What do they mean? And how is it going to be interpreted? So actually, Brexit, but the wider context in all of Europe, these have been, stormy years. Now we find ourselves in the COVID-19 crisis. This has not been a quiet period, and it has not been a Brexit-only dominated period. But Brexit was, fascinating and moving. And again, you can look at it on a political level, but you can look at it on, for the UK, this is futures and young people's futures, and the value of people's mortgages and their career prospects. Again, it feeds into the populism debate. It's about identity. Who am I? Who am I? What does it mean to be British? What does it mean to be Scottish? What does it mean to be Welsh? What does it mean to be a Londoner or a metropolitan elite or citizen of nowhere, or whatever it is? It's all about identity politics. And I think that goes right back to me to Kosovo, or right back to the beginning. It's about, who am I? And the politics behind that is still what excites me now as much as it did right at the beginning, I think.
And how do you think then the COVID-19 crisis will affect this question of who am I, and do you think populism will kind of evolve, take new forms in Europe in the upcoming months?
So I think if you look so far, they haven't done very well if they want to galvanize public opinion. And I think that's because, first of all, when people were talking about the rise of populism in Europe, that in itself shows black and white rather than shades of grey, because sort of the parties that were called populist would vary enormously, from Greece, where it's the populist far left, to France, where it's the populist far right, to all sorts of shades in between. And because these politicians stepped into a gap in the market, as I said, after the financial crisis, people felt they weren't being listened to and their concerns weren't being listened to. They're chameleons as well, so they will move their politics and change their politics, because something that's completely noticeable is that whereas populism and Euroscepticism, as in, I call it more Brussels skepticism, is alive and well across Europe, the call to leave the European Union has pretty much disappeared. And those parties that stood for it so strongly in 2016 have had to temper that debate because the people who follow them, you know, they think Brussels is in the interest of big industry maybe and all the rest of it, but they don't actually want to leave the bloc. So they've had to temper it. What I think has changed so much since 2016, when we were talking about the Brexit domino effect, and it wasn't Brexit, but we were talking about possible Dexit for Denmark, Italexit, Grexit for Greece, and so on. Is like I say, those countries aren't pulling away, and the mainstream politicians have got wiser, which means they've put populist tools in their toolbox. Is that a good or bad thing? Depends, doesn't it? Because if populism comes from the idea of the voice of the people, and if the appeal of populist politicians was because so many people felt they weren't being listened to, then if mainstream politicians say, I'm listening, and don't just say it, but start listening, is that a bad thing? If the argument they're taking is an anti-immigrant, racist argument that appealed in some sectors, is that a good thing? So I think, you know, again, it's about shades of grey. You know, populist, centre, mainstream, whatever. If you look at the Dutch, for example, Mark Rutte, the Prime Minister, you know, he has weaved a way to stay as Prime Minister by grabbing from the far right at election time. He's very hard on immigration before elections because he knows it appeals to a broader perspective, also the kind of more agricultural vote in the Netherlands. When he's then in government, he doesn't act in the same way. Is this good? Is this bad? That's for you to judge. It's politics, but it's part of the movement that you're seeing. You know, Sebastian Kurz in Austria went into government with the far right. You know, was that a good or a bad thing? He said it was to temper the far right. And actually, while they were in government with him, they got very discredited. He's now in a new government with the Greens. Is that good or bad? Is that politics? You know, it's all part of a very interesting movement and pattern in Europe. Are Green parties on the rise? Well, they seem to be, but you come to a crisis like COVID-19 and everyone is looking to the establishment to help them. So I don't think you can predict. I mean, just an example is Germany, where the Green Party was about to sort of bypass Angela Merkel's party. They've disappeared into the wilderness now with the Social Democrats during COVID-19 because mummy's there, mutti's there. You know, Merkel is the hands of her party's the CDU. She's always, I mean, even though people were writing her off before COVID-19, her popularity ratings have generally been the envy of a lot of other prime ministers and leaders across Europe. But her party was just like, you know, in the doldrums. And now the whole thing has risen up because in a time of crisis, people are like, who are the safe pair of hands? And normally they'll look to the government and just hope that they're the safe pair of hands. So I think a fool would predict where Europe is going now. But what I do think is that, you know, quote unquote, mainstream politicians have got a lot wiser. And that goes back to my Reuters times as a greenhorn with Berlusconi. Berlusconi's right. What did he do? He used football. He went into bed with the far right. He said he was a businessman, not a politician, and therefore a man of the people. It's not, we're reinventing the wheel and reinventing the wheel. You can look across to Trump or you can look to the Philippines. The same kind of things are going. It's more like, you know, when you bake, I'm sorry to say baking, but that's because it's COVID-19 and we've all been doing so much baking. You know, you've got these ingredients on the table and the politicians are going to choose which ingredients they're going to take to try and appeal to the public. And so I think that a lot of the talk at the moment about, you know, the EU's falling apart, look at the lack of solidarity, the Dutch against the Italians, they should be paying. A lot of this, I can tell you, having been around the block so many times now, is headline stuff and it's about domestic politics. The Dutch have got a general election next year. They want to prove to the taxpayer they're protecting their money. You know, Conte in Italy has to be seen to be giving the EU a hard time because the Italians were one of the most Eurosceptic countries before COVID-19. And if he doesn't rattle the cage, he's toast politically at home. Are those two leaders so far apart in person? Or when it comes to wanting their countries to stay in the EU and go forward, they disagree, but not to the extent that you see like in the headlines. They generate those headlines very much for domestic consumption. So the EU is not in danger. We're not in 2016, but I think the future of what entity it is a federalist project. It looks very, very far away from the United States of Europe, that's for sure.
Just very, very last question from me before we take our one question from the audience. How will COVID-19 affect Brexit? What is next? What's the next timeline?
So I think because everybody's running out of things to talk about or to write about apart from COVID-19, it's now COVID-19 and Brexit. And, you know, there's a logic in it because, you know, the government says that there won't be an extension to the standstill transition period past the end of the year. And therefore, you know, the famous clock is ticking. I don't think COVID-19 has had a massive effect on this because I think Boris Johnson is pretty convinced in what he wants and he doesn't want. I don't think that's changed. I think the EU red lines were very clear and they haven't changed. So I think suggestions that the government is running down the clock so that the EU feels under pressure to give in to the UK's red lines, well, they made that mistake last time. I think time pressure is useful in politics, and the UK is not wrong with that. The EU would like discussions to extend even up to 2 years. You heard Michel Barnier saying that on Friday. You'd have never heard that before. But, you know, it means us paying more into the budget. And, you know, it means more chance that we might choose a closer relationship. I think the EU is finding it hard to accept the government line that it doesn't really want very preferential access to the single market. It will renounce that in order to have sovereignty, freedom, blah, 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 and to be free from the rules. And I think a lot of people across the European Union in leadership positions haven't accepted that, or they have and think the longer this goes on, the more chance that could soften. So I think you're seeing that at play. When you have a time limit, it focuses people's minds. The red lines between the two sides are so strong that you need political intervention. And this is where COVID-19 comes in, because everybody's distracted. Nobody's thinking about Brexit. I mean, you know, I get asked sometimes on the UK, you know, side of things, what's the kind of thinking, not in Brussels and the Commission, but in wider Europe. They're not thinking about Brexit. They couldn't give a hoot right now about Brexit. They're thinking about their own political careers and whether they survive COVID-19. They're thinking about their public, the death rate, their economies. And as a collective, the EU is thinking about its future post-COVID-19, how to manage the economic fallout. And there are some who are thinking, how do we use the economic fallout to actually make the single market even stronger? And now that the US and China have discredited themselves, they feel, through the COVID-19 crisis, you've seen, you know, weaknesses in both of those systems, both on a kind of voter level when it comes to welfare systems, but also politically. The EU would like to go in to that gap. That's what's focusing minds on many kind of on the short, medium, and long term, not Brexit. But as the clock ticks, as we get sort of further to the summer, and at the moment you've got this sort of stock-taking exercise at the beginning of June, which the EU says can't be moved. I've never met an EU timetable that can't be moved, so I really wouldn't pay that much attention to that. But as you're kind of getting to the summer, sort of autumn, you will then get to a stage where both sides will think, do we extend this maybe by a few months? Or is, you know, does Johnson absolutely insist? In which case, the EU will work to come up with something. What you need on both sides is political engagement for compromise. Because as it is, if the UK doesn't budge and the EU doesn't budge, there can be no agreement, because the EU will not sign without, you know, at the moment it's saying we won't sign for like a whole lot of fisheries and, you know, competition regulations and so on. At the moment it won't budge. So the UK is going to have to budge and the EU is going to have to budge. They'll both argue as to how much each side has to budge. Of course, each side says it's the other side. And so we've been here before. But you need political engagement. The Commission itself cannot do this. France and Germany, it comes down to them in the end, right? Or the countries also closer. Because if you think about it, how much does Romania care about the trade deal? Not much. Doesn't do that much trade. So it's mainly, there's certain countries that have a real interest, a really strong interest in the trade relationship. But first and foremost comes France and Germany. You need to have an engagement there. And on the UK side, you need to have that political engagement to make the red lines go pink. And then you can get something. But I don't think this conversation will be over, even if that pretty flimsy piece of paper arrives by the 31st of December. That won't be the whole conversation in EU-UK relations by miles. There will be add-ons or further discussions to this relationship, whether or not there is a piece of paper at the end of this year, going on for, I would say, probably years to come.
Thank you, Katya. Just a very, very final question from the audience. This is from Florine at Trinity, and she asks, as a linguist and aspiring journalist myself, I'm very interested to know, do you believe that speaking the language of the person you're interviewing or the person you're reporting on makes for a better report or interview? As in, are you better equipped to understand cultural norms or make people feel at ease?
Well, clearly, yes, to all of those. But does that mean you're a bad reporter if you don't speak somebody's language? No. I mean, you can read up and educate yourself on cultural norms. I speak lots of European languages, but I speak very basic Hebrew and Arabic, enough to, I always think you should make an effort. I think it's inexcusable not to make an effort. And I think when you go somewhere, you should learn some phrases because A, it's polite, and B, it opens doors as a journalist, because it opens doors and hearts. I mean, a hardened politician probably couldn't give a hoot, but you know, again, if you're going out and about and you show that you've bothered and that you care, then also people are going to assume that you will know a bit more about cultural sensitivities. But you know, in the Middle East, speaking Arabic is not, you know not to take a man's hand, to shake it. That already, that's going to open your doors. That's a non-verbal language, but it's a very important language. So I would say that, of course, I'm a linguist and I'm going to say, learn all the languages. I think it's great. I do think it's really important. But when you travel around as a journalist, I think the cultural norms are more important than the language, because you will offend and close doors immediately if you ignore them. And I think it's not just cultural things, which, by the way, as somebody who's lived and worked across Europe, really varies from country to country as well. You can't say in the Middle East this, in Europe this. You really need to kind of look at your countries and sometimes at your regions as well in the country. All the tiny details will help you. Do your homework. More than learn a language, do your homework. There are so many journalists who don't do their homework, who don't do their research. If you want something that's going to close a door, it's making something stupid like that. It's like trampling on something or showing ignorance about somebody. You could have easily done your homework, but also showing about a wider situation or somebody's personal history that will open doors to you. So I think it's very much a package, but I would always encourage learning a language. Also because because like my Arabic wasn't strong enough to do interviews, you have a translator with you. That's always going to be a weakness, because in theory, especially if you're a freelance, you don't know what political background your translator comes from. So you need to vet them very much. If you're going into a conflict area, like even if they roughly translate, the nuance is so important. And I found that very much with Brexit, for example. I listen to Macron and Merkel in their own languages, and often they are mistranslated in the press. Not willfully, but because you can find a word, look up a dictionary, and there's 3 different meanings to a word. You'll pick whatever meaning. But if you understand that language, you'll understand the context and the nuance of how they're speaking. And often it wasn't the kind of like headline grabbing insult, or in Merkel's case, suggestion she was going to break all the rules just to have a good deal with the UK. So if you like, it's with her particularly, because when Tony Blair was Prime Minister in the UK, he was called Teflon Tony because nothing could stick on him. She's a little bit like that. In Germany, they say she's like a titter pudding, like a jelly that you throw her at the wall, and she's sort of, you can't really touch it. That's not very respectful to Angela Merkel, but you can't really touch, she doesn't come across as a populist, but she has largely, not in the migration crisis, but moved her career and her politics according to public opinion polls and where she thinks public opinion is. And she is the master at making statements that are open to interpretation by whoever listens. You know, like, let's discuss Shakespeare. You know, who is Macbeth? What does he mean? What does Lady Macbeth's soliloquy mean? You know, for me, I often think about, because I love Macbeth. It was one of my favorite things to study at school. And I know Merkel doesn't come across as Lady Macbeth, and I don't mean to draw a total parallel, but that many, many interpretations of her soliloquy, of Lady Macbeth's soliloquy, it reminds me of O-level GCSE because of Merkel, because she will be interpreted by the left, by the right, by Brexiteers, by Remainers. You know, she's the master. She uses that as a political tool. So is a language important then? Damn right. Is understanding the way Germans think, like why Merkel particularly is such a successful leader in Germany, but she wouldn't be in France. You've got to understand that. You've got to understand the countries. And so that's why at the sort of aged point where I am now, as I say, I'm still excited by the same adventure in journalism. You know, the people behind the politics, the people behind the politicians, and all these interpretations and sort of onion level peeling that you can do on all of this. And language helps, and understanding a culture helps. And I think that in Brexit, it really helped me, because I've lived in Germany, I've lived in Austria, I've lived in France, I've lived in Italy, I've lived in Spain, and I've worked, you know, so I feel like I can understand, and I have confidence when I say the German car manufacturers will never pressurize the government to give a good deal, particularly for the UK, because of blah, blah. I don't need to read it somewhere or be told that in a lecture. I know that. I know that because I just know how it works there. So learn languages, learn loads and loads of languages. And if you have time, which you won't do when you have a career and too many children, read books in those languages. I mean, you know, I miss that. You guys read books all the time. I'd say when people say COVID-19, I'm watching everything on Netflix and reading every book that I haven't read on my bookshelf. I'm not able to do that. Because, you know, I'm homeschooling 3 children as well as trying to work from home. So enjoy the reading while you can, in as many different languages as you can. I would say that's my
Thank you
advice.
so much, Katya. It's been absolutely wonderful talking to you. It's been fascinating. And thank you so much for joining us.
It's been absolutely lovely to join you. I really enjoyed it. Sorry, I gave very long answers, but that's what happens when you're free from 1:10 on the 10 o'clock news.
No, it's perfect. Thank you.